Today we're going to briefly go over one simple machine, the wheel and the axle. The wheel and the axle, categorized as a simple machine, and we want to talk about mechanical advantage of the wheel and axle. Essentially, with a wheel and an axle, most people tend to think of automobile tire, because that's usually what we talk about is a wheel and an axle. Two wheels attached by an axle. But what we want to think about to help illustrate the point of the mechanical advantage of the wheel and axle is something more along the lines of a steering wheel. Essentially, the steering is done by the central column. But if you had to grip that central column and turn it with your hand this way, it would be almost impossible. So by attaching a wheel to that central axle and moving the radius of that circle out, it takes much less force to turn the central axle and therefore to turn the car. So what you have then is a mixture of one type of force, the wheel, attached to the axle, making it easier then to do what you would ordinarily have to exert a great deal of force if you grabbed the main axle itself and tried to turn it by itself. So I've got a picture here. This is the central axle here. This is the outer wheel of the steering wheel, if you will. If we had to grab the central column and turn it, it would be almost impossible for us to get enough force. But you move the wheel out, attach to the axle, and you apply force out here, and it becomes much easier to turn here. So force here translates here to greater force. So the mechanical advantage increases with the radius. So I've got an example up here. If we've got a radius of 12 versus a radius of 10, with our axiom over here, the mechanical advantage increases with the radius. Bigger radius, 12, means greater mechanical advantage. What we mean by that is if the same amount of force was applied to the outer wheel at 10 inches and the same amount of force applied to the wheel at 12 inches, you would get a much greater advantage at the 12-inch radius than at the 10, assuming the same amount of force is applied. It becomes, it translates here to the central axle much greater. So the mechanical advantage is greater the larger the wheel is. And in the same way, if you've got a larger wheel, it takes less force to turn it. So if you think about it, sometimes in little sporty cars, they have sort of smaller steering wheels, but when you get to something as big as a bus or an 18-wheeler, they usually have very large steering wheels. And this is just an application of this simple machine, the wheel and the axle, the mechanical advantage increasing as the radius also increases. Well, this has just been a basic overview then of the simple machine, wheel and axle. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video, you'll find a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to that website that has that information. And while you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a process used by plants and other autotrophic organisms to convert light energy, usually from the sun, into chemical energy that can be used by the organism. Photosynthesis usually gives off oxygen as a waste product as well. Oxygen is not something that the plant or other autotrophic organism will need in most cases, and so it will give off oxygen as a waste product. Now, autotrophic means that these organisms make their own food. They are capable of creating their own food. They can harness the light energy and create their own source of nourishment. Heterotrophs cannot do that and must rely on autotrophs or other heterotrophs for their nourishment. Most plants, most algae, and cyanobacteria perform photosynthesis and are called photoautotrophs. So, autotrophs are organisms that can create their own food. Photoautotrophs are organisms that create their own food from light, since photo translates to light, looking at the Latin root for that word. These are organisms that can create their own nourishment from light. Photosynthesis maintains atmospheric oxygen levels and supplies most of the energy necessary for life on Earth. So, as these autotrophic organisms take in carbon dioxide, they let out oxygen and help maintain the atmospheric oxygen levels, because people and other organisms exhale carbon dioxide, and the plants or other autotrophs take that carbon dioxide in and turn it back into oxygen, which we breathe. So if we didn't have photosynthesis, we'd be running low on oxygen. And so photosynthesis helps maintain our oxygen levels. It also supplies most of the energy necessary for life on Earth. Even though you don't feel like you're eating light or getting your energy just from light, if you eat a vegetable, then you're eating something that it has only been able to grow because it used light energy to provide nourishment for itself. So you are now eating that plant, which got its energy and was able to grow from light. If you were to eat a cow, if you had beef, if you had a hamburger, then you would be eating another heterotroph. Cows can't make their own food, but they ate grass and other vegetables and other foods that were grown, and they were grown by having light energy harnessed inside those plants. And so the cow got the energy from the plant, which got the energy from the light, and then you were getting energy from the cow. So it all comes back to the light energy. So while there are other sources of energy, the light energy is a primary source for everything going on Earth. Photosynthesis always begins when energy from light is absorbed by proteins that contain green chlorophyll pigments. So the autotrophs that perform photosynthesis don't always look green, but somewhere in their body, they're going to have these chlorophyll pigments that are able to take in and absorb light to start the process of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis occurs in two stages. You have your light reactions or light-dependent reactions. So these depend on light to happen. And it's when organisms capture and store the light energy. The light energy is converted to chemical energy in the form of NADPH and ATP. So in this light reaction or light-dependent reaction stage, the light energy is actually captured, turned into a chemical form of energy that can be stored or immediately used if necessary. In the carbon dioxide fixing reactions or light-independent reactions, these are ones that can happen even whenever light isn't present, as long as there was some energy harnessed in that plant already. So these don't have to happen while there is light present supplying energy. They can happen later. And this is when the formed NADPH and ATP, so it's already stored and formed in that autotroph, those two energy molecules drive the reduction of carbon dioxide to more useful organic compounds, such as glucose. And they are also referred to as the Calvin or Calvin-Benson cycle. So when the carbon dioxide is reduced, that process can be called the Calvin or Calvin-Benson cycle as well. So even though this is a light-independent reaction, it does still depend on molecules that were created by converting light energy into a stored chemical energy. So even though we call them light independent, they really couldn't occur if you didn't have the light transferring, the light energy that was able to be transferred to these energy molecules that are stored chemically. The main thing to remember about photosynthesis is that it is the process by which autotrophs can make their own energy using light.
We can classify cells into two categories, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So prokaryotic cells are smaller than eukaryotic cells. In addition to being smaller, they lack membrane-bound nucleuses. So they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. Now, they contain single-stranded circular DNA molecules that free float in, you can probably guess, they free float in cytoplasm, because cytoplasm is kind of the fluid in a cell that all the other organelles in the cell float around in. So the DNA molecules free float in cytoplasm. So some different organelles that are in prokaryotic cells are ribosomes, centrioles, often one or more flagella, and cytoskeleton elements. Then we have eukaryotic cells, and so these are going to be obviously larger than prokaryotic cells. And these contain linear, double-stranded DNA combined with histone and packaged as chromosomes. And then the chromosomes are found inside a nucleus bounded by two membranes. So notice here, the eukaryotic cells do have a membrane-bound nucleus. Now, eukaryotic cells contain a variety of other membrane-bound organelles, such as mitochondria, chloroplast, endoplasmic reticula, Golgi bodies, lysosomes, and vacuoles. Now, eukaryotic ribosomes are larger and more complex than those found in prokaryotes, which is what is another way of saying prokaryotic cells. Now, you may be wondering, where do you find prokaryotic cells and where do you find eukaryotic cells? Well, prokaryotic cells are usually in single-celled organisms, such as bacteria, whereas eukaryotic cells are what you find in more complex organisms. It's what you see the result of on a daily basis, because plants and animals are made up of eukaryotic cells. So that's a look at prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and the differences between them. Light is the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that is visible because of its ability to stimulate the retina. Light is absorbed and emitted by electrons, atoms, and molecules that move from one energy level to another. So an atom might release energy to move to a lower energy level, but absorb energy to move to a higher energy level. Now, visible light is between ultraviolet and infrared light on the spectrum. So it's anywhere from 380 nanometers all the way up to 760 nanometers. So 380 would correspond to the color violet, and 760 would correspond to the color red. This is because the human brain interprets or perceives visible light as color. For example, when the entire wavelength reaches the retina, the brain perceives the color white. Now, when no part of the wavelength reaches the retina, the brain perceives the color black. Atoms and molecules can gain or lose energy only in particular discrete amounts. Therefore, they can absorb and emit light only at wavelengths that correspond to these amounts. So, using a process known as spectroscopy, these characteristic wavelengths can be used to identify substances.
Genes. A gene is a molecular unit of heredity of a living organism. A gene is the basic instruction, a sequence of nucleic acids. So a gene is going to be the instruction, it's going to be the sequence of nucleic acids that tells the cell to code for a certain protein or for a certain RNA chain. It isn't just one little thing, it's a sequence that gives an instruction to the cell. While an allele codes for one variant of that gene. So if you've heard someone say, oh, she has really good hair genes, or she's got the gene for blue eyes, that's not exactly true, because everyone has a gene for eye color or hair color, and for every other trait that you have. But what determines what color your hair is or what color your eyes are is going to be the alleles for that gene. So there are dominant alleles and recessive alleles. And if you have even one dominant allele, then you're going to have the dominant gene. If you have two recessive alleles, then you will have that recessive gene. For instance, if you have two parents that have brown eyes, you could still end up with blue eyes because blue is a recessive gene. So both of your parents had one dominant and one recessive brown and blue eye color allele. The brown would have been prevalent in both of them. But since they both had that recessive blue allele present, you could still end up with blue eyes because of the recessive alleles combining. And I know that all sounds a little confusing, but it's just to tell you that each gene doesn't determine something all on its own. It's the alleles that are the variants of that gene that determine what the outcome of each gene sequence is. Genes do specify all proteins and functional chains. So they specify how these are going to be created, the functional RNA chains. Genes hold the information needed to build and maintain an organism's cells and pass genetic traits to offspring. So where I was talking about two parents that could have brown eyes and still pass on the blue eye color, it's because of the alleles that they carry, whether dominant or recessive, whether you can see it as a physical trait or not. Your parents carried genetic traits and they passed those on to you. And some of your physical traits may not all be the same as one or both of your parents, but the genetic traits that you got did come from the alleles that they had combined and mixed together. So you took some of your mother's alleles and some of your father's alleles, and when those combined, you ended up with different alleles and different genetic traits of your own, but they both came from the genetic traits your parents had. Some examples are eye color, number of limbs, and blood type. So some genes you can see right away manifested, such as eye color or number of limbs. But blood type is something that you would have to do a little more scientific research to discover. You can also search for certain markers in your body for diseases such as Alzheimer's or other hereditary diseases. Those can be tested for, and your DNA will show, your genes will show if you have a likelihood of getting that disease. And so that's definitely not something you can see just by looking at someone. It's something that you would have to do more research into. But it's possible by looking at the genes in your body. Now, for a gene to create or code for its protein, it must go through transcription. And transcription is where single-stranded messenger RNA or mRNA is created that is complementary to the DNA from which it was transcribed. And we'll look at that over here in just a minute. But basically, you're starting with DNA and you're transcribing it into the messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA is going to bring the message elsewhere in the cell. So next comes translation. That messenger RNA is used as a template for synthesizing a new protein. Transfer RNA, or tRNA, brings the amino acids and anticodon necessary for protein synthesis. And something to remember is that genes are read 3 nucleotides at a time in units called codons. So you look at the 3 nucleotides that are coding for this one protein, and they're going to be transcribed onto messenger RNA, which is going to travel elsewhere in the cell, and transfer RNA is going to bring the amino acids and the anticodon that match up with that set of 3, with that codon, and let the protein be created. So let's look at that over here. Let's pretend this gene sequence came from a strand of DNA. And remember, your bases are adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. So we are going to say it's going to change from DNA to the messenger RNA. So we're transcribing here. And each base must be transcribed. So here we've got our transcription. So the guanine is going to transcribe to cytosine, cytosine to guanine, thymine to adenine, cytosine to guanine. There we go. Thymine to adenine and thymine to adenine. So the messenger RNA is going to carry this sequence. So you can see how it isn't exactly what was on the DNA, it's what base would have paired with the DNA. So it's kind of like a code you've got to sit here and figure out. You've got to decode what the messenger RNA says. So the messenger RNA has the pairs that would have gone with the DNA, and so in comes your transfer RNA, which is going to have its amino acids and the anticodon that's necessary for each of these. So each set of 3 is a codon, and it gets transferred over. And so now the transfer RNA is going to come in, and it's going to bring what we need. So it's going to say, okay, we had cytosine, so now we need the guanine. I guess we should really point this way. And then it's going to bring cytosine back to pair with the guanine, thymine back to pair with adenine, cytosine back to pair with guanine, thymine to pair with adenine, and thymine to pair with adenine. So now in a different part of the cell, you've got these codons, and they're going to code for a certain protein. And this is what happens in the cell. So this part would be your translation. So you've got strands of DNA. Part of the cell says, oh, I need a certain protein. Well, this codon codes for one of the proteins you need, and this codon codes for one of the other proteins you need. So the DNA is going to send it. The messenger RNA is going to hold the transcription, which is where it's changed to what the pairs would be. What pairs with each base is going to be the transcription that goes on the messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA travels off into the cell to where the protein is needed. The transfer RNA is going to bring the bases plus amino acids. And then you're going to get these bases plus the new amino acids are going to give you your proteins that these codons were coding for. So you've got your transcription where it's coded onto the messenger RNA, and then you've got translation where it's decoded and the transfer RNA brings in what you need plus amino acids and your proteins are created. So that's kind of a complicated process, but it's what genes do. That's their job. Their job is to send messages throughout the cell so that new proteins can be created. And they are going to carry your hereditary information, and they have the basic instructions necessary to tell your body how to carry out the hereditary processes and keep producing the genes that you keep producing the cells and the proteins that you need and maintaining your cells. So just keep in mind, genes are units of hereditary information, and they carry messages throughout the cell and instruct the cell on how to create the proteins that your body needs. Ancient Greece. Ancient Greece was dominated by 2 city-states. Athens was a coastal city made wealthy by overseas trade. Since they were on the coast, they were able to trade far and wide, and that's what produced the wealth for Athens. They had a democratic form of government. So they treated each person as if they were important. There weren't classes. Each person was a part of this democracy. They are known as leaders in philosophy and the arts. In fact, Socrates engaged in dialogues in the street. His student Plato recorded his philosophies, and Plato's student Aristotle developed a strict form of reasoning that forms the basis of Western philosophy even today. And Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these are all names that I'm sure you've heard before. Athens is also famous for its architecture, namely the Parthenon. This is something that is still standing today, even if it isn't in as great of a shape as it was back then. And it's just an example of the advanced architecture that Athens was able to develop. Now, this is one of the two city-states. Athens is one of the two city-states that was important in Greece, that dominated Greece, one of the two main city-states. The other one was Sparta. Sparta was a city devoted to agriculture and the military, located away from the coast and therefore somewhat isolated. So Sparta wasn't as concerned with trade. They didn't live near the coast. They were concerned with agriculture, and they developed a strong military. They didn't try to interact with their neighbors very much. They didn't use open sea to travel anywhere very often. They weren't as big on trade. They were bigger on staying where they were, focusing on agriculture, focusing on military. So they were able to defend themselves and conquer other areas if necessary. Sparta was governed by a strict class system in which people worked the land of other people. So there were higher classes and lower classes, and the lower class people basically worked as serfs. So they worked the land or the fields of the higher class people in exchange for having a place to live and food to eat. But they didn't own any of the land themselves and weren't able to decide what to do with it. Military training was mandatory, with children leaving their homes and families at a very young age to go off and train. Sparta stressed the good of the group over the individual. So they didn't value one person as much as they valued the good or the success of their group, of their culture as a whole, while Athens celebrated the achievements of the individual. And you'll remember Athens was a democracy. Athens celebrated philosophy and the arts, and so they were more focused on the individual's value, where Sparta was more focused on the value and success of the group versus just one individual succeeding or surviving. Now, during the time that Athens and Sparta were the dominant two city-states, there were a few different periods that Greece went through. So one was the Periclean Age. And that was during the 5th century BC. And most of the great contributions to the Western culture were made during this period. The philosophy of Socrates, the medical work of Hippocrates, great dramatic works by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. So all of these contributions that you still read, these dramatic works, you hear about the Greek tragedies, these were written during the Periclean Age. You hear the Hippocratic oath that doctors take. That had to do with the medical work of Hippocrates during the Periclean Age. So they made the philosophers and other thinkers of this time made some great contributions during the Periclean Age. Now, what helped everyone else find out about these things was the Hellenistic Age. And during the Hellenistic Age, around the 4th century BC, this period is mostly known for Alexander the Great's military expansions. But without his conquests, without his expansions, without him making the empire larger and larger that he was in charge of, these philosophies and innovations from ancient Greece wouldn't have gotten very far. So the fact that Alexander the Great did go out and conquer all these other areas, he spread the Greek culture. And so he spread these philosophies and these innovations and caused them to have a great impact on the Western culture, the Western world, how everything else developed from there on. If it had only stayed in Sparta and Athens, where the Greek homelands were, it would be a little bit different than if it had actually gone out as far as it did whenever Alexander the Great conquered all the surrounding area and made Greece a much larger area. So ancient Greece was dominated by two city-states, the Athens and Sparta. And Athens was a democracy that focused more on the individual, where Sparta focused more on the group. Athens was focused on philosophy and the arts, where Sparta was focused more on the military side of things. And that's kind of reflected in these two ages. The Periclean age had to do with the development of philosophies. It was a time of thinking and developing the contributions they were going to have for the world. The Hellenistic age had more to do with military conquest and the spreading of those contributions to the Western world. The Egyptians. The Egyptians lived in a concentrated area along the lower parts of the Nile River around 3000 BC. And they were able to predict flooding and control irrigation, which made the Nile River Valley a very fertile area. And since they grew surplus crops, Egyptians had time to pursue other interests. So the Egyptians lived in the Nile River Valley, the lower part of the land along the lower part of the Nile River, and they could predict when floods would occur, and they also had control of irrigation techniques. So they were able to farm a lot of that land and grow enough crops that they had plenty to spare. They had some to store up for the future, for times of drought or famine, and they had time to do other things. So they were definitely a farming community, but they had lots of other interests because their civilization developed in a very fertile area that made for an easier life than some of the other civilizations that were developing around the same time period. So the Egyptians developed writing. They had that extra time. They developed a system of writing. They farmed minerals from the valley and surrounding desert. So they figured out what minerals they could use from the ground, and they would go and farm them as well, or mine them out, because they had all this extra time. So they farmed the land, but they also farmed the minerals. They developed a vast trading network. So they have all this extra food, they've got these minerals, they can write, they can make jewelry, pottery. They had a lot of art, and their art and architecture were modeled throughout other civilizations in the surrounding areas as the Egyptians developed more and more. So they had a vast trading network. They would trade very far away from where they lived, and people would come from far away to trade with them. They developed a military to defend against attacks. So you can imagine living in this fertile valley. Other civilizations are going to say, hey, that spot looks really great. I want to live there. I want our people to live there. So the Egyptians did have to defend Egypt against attacks because this Nile River Valley was a pretty popular place, and people saw that it was good land and they tried to make it their own. So Egypt had to develop a military. They formulated an effective system of medicine. So they were able to record symptoms and say, oh, this looks similar to when this other person was sick. This is what we gave them and it made it better. This person doesn't look like they're getting better. They may have this much time to live. This person has a wound. If we put this medicine and wrap it up, it will get better. So they had an effective system of medicine. They organized collective construction. In fact, one of the Egyptians' greatest achievements were their pyramids. And the pyramids were not something that just a few people could build. These took lots and lots of time and lots of manpower to build. So the pyramids are something that a lot of people associate with Egypt even today. And back then, remember I said that a lot of other people modeled the Egyptians' art and architecture. One of their architectural things that people wanted to copy were the pyramids. They were very impressive. Even now they're very impressive, but for them to be able to make it back then without all of the modern equipment that we have was very impressive. So pyramids were originally built as burial sites for pharaohs who were the leaders in Egypt. And they were believed to continue ruling in the afterlife. So they made these huge pyramids and they buried the pharaohs in there after they died. And they buried them with food and with servants and with animals, with gold, jewels. They wanted them to be entertained and fed and have plenty to drink and have plenty of people to wait on them in the afterlife as well. And so they buried all of this with them, thinking it would all go with the pharaoh to the next life. Peasants worked on the pyramids in exchange for food and shelter. So for people who maybe didn't have their own area of land, people who wanted these pyramids built would say, okay, you come build on the pyramid, we'll feed you and make sure you've got a place to live. The shape of the pyramids is meant to symbolize the slanting rays of the sun, and if you think about the way that the pyramids slant down, and the sloping sides were also thought to help the souls of the pharaohs climb to the sky to join the other gods. So slanting rays down from the sun, but also it slants up toward the sun from the ground, and so the pharaoh's soul was supposed to be assisted by those sloping sides. It could make its way up toward the sky to join the other gods. And just to give you an example of how much time and how much labor a pyramid might take, the largest pyramid from this time took around 20 years and around 100,000 laborers to complete. So if a pharaoh came into power, he better start getting his pyramid built really quickly, because by the time that it was done, it would be about the time he was going to be needing it. So the Egyptians were a very accomplished people. They were very ahead of their time, both in architecture and art, and they lived in the fertile Nile River Valley around 3000 BC. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 19th century produced immediate and far-reaching changes in the social structure. New energy sources, such as the steam engine, made great increases in productivity possible. So there were several different new energy sources. They found new ways to use water power. They found, such as with the steam engine, that's harnessing water as steam. They also found new ways to use coal, new ways to practice metallurgy. There was a lot of new ways to use energy that they'd previously used, or newfound sources of energy. And all of those things combined to increase productivity. The factory system for manufacturing textiles was implemented, meaning that individuals were only required to do one in a series of tasks required to prepare a piece of cloth. So each person would know how to do one job, or a couple people would know how to do one job, and then they'd do their one part and pass it off to the next step. And at the next step, a couple of people would know how to do that job, and so no one had to know how to make the whole piece or whole bolt of cloth. They only had to know how to do a certain part of it. And so this division of labor also increased productivity. Before, one person would do all the jobs, and they may be really good at one part but really bad at another part, or they may be really quick at one part but really slow at another part. So this let people work where their strengths could shine and where their strengths would get the most use. So someone who was really fast at the first step of the process could work there, someone who was really fast at the last step could work there, and all the spots in the middle. So everyone was trained to do just one in a series of tasks instead of one person having to do all the tasks. And that made things go quicker and increased productivity. So with the success of the textile industry and new energy resources, more and more workers were needed in European cities. So before, there were people in cities, but there were also a lot of people that lived out in the country on farms or had their own homes on a piece of land where they grew their own food. And there were people that flocked to the cities for art or learning, but they didn't really come there for work as much. Only the merchants could really get a job coming from the farmlands into the city. But now people began to abandon their country lives and take factory jobs in town, in different cities across Europe. Now, industrialization did come to England before it came anywhere else, but it quickly spread throughout Europe and then just a little while later over to America. So once it started, it spread quickly, but it did begin in England. Now, people left their country lives to go work in these factories because now there was a new job there. There was something they could go and have a possible better life than they did on their farms. And this rapid urbanization, which is when urban areas grow quickly, such as the areas within a city or surrounding a city, this rapid urbanization created a new middle class in Europe. So let's look at some of the pros to the urbanization and how that middle class developed. As people flooded the cities to work in booming factories, large landowners consolidated the farmlands they left behind. So people would flood to the cities to work, and they would sell off their farms so that they could make that move and have somewhere to live and a little bit of money to live on while they got set up in their new job. Large landowners would say, okay, we'll stay here and just keep taking all the land, we'll buy it off of them as they leave, and we'll have lots and lots of land, and we can do with it whatever we want to make the most money. So this was a good thing for the large landowners because they were going to be able to have more land. And it did give the people who were flocking to the cities a way to get a little money to start them off, but they were giving up the place that they had lived and had a home and had at least food to eat. Now, they may not have been able to make as much money. If they had just a small area to plant, they may have only been able to make enough food for themselves and not enough to make money. So moving into the cities gave them an opportunity to possibly be able to make more money and become wealthier as a family. The booming success of industry made many people rich as investors and merchants, and the middle class gained even more political power in Europe. So where the middle class didn't have as much political power because they weren't as wealthy as the upper class citizens, now the middle class was becoming richer and it was gaining more political power. Social mobility was much more possible in this economic environment, encouraging many people to stick with jobs that were demeaning and not especially lucrative. Well, social mobility is the idea that you can move from one class to another. So a lower class citizen who may have been virtually a peasant out on the farms may have moved in, got a factory job, people saw that he did a good job and he gets promoted and he makes way more money that way and can actually move up into the lower class and then move into the middle class and maybe even higher. But instead of being trapped in the class that you were born in, there's a lot more mobility. You could sell your farm that had made you plenty of money in hopes of going and investing in a factory in the city, and your factory could fail. So you could drop from middle class or upper middle class to lower class very quickly, or you could go as a peasant or a lower class farmer and do well in one of the factories or become a supervisor there, and you could end up making more money and rise from being lower class up to middle class or higher. So there was a lot more mobility here as far as social class goes, and the reason that I encouraged many people to stick with jobs that were demeaning and not very lucrative was that they had the opportunity to advance. So they may say, okay, well, I'm going to take this factory job. It's not paying me very much money. It's not paying me as much as I could have made on my farm. But if I do a good job, maybe I can move up. Maybe I can save up enough money to be able to invest in something. Maybe I can start my own factory someday. So people had ambition, and they envisioned having more opportunity here rather than opportunities out on the farms. There wasn't as much available for them to move social class-wise out there, where in the cities, there was always that possibility. This rapid urbanization also created a number of problems. So many people moving to the city at once would create some problems. First of all, most cities did not have the infrastructure to support a large population explosion. So they didn't have the streets, first of all, but they also didn't have any of the city services in place for such a large population. They were used to maintaining who they had in the city, that level of a population that was slowly growing. They weren't used to having so many people come all at once. So they didn't have the housing, they didn't have sewer, they didn't have running water, they didn't have enough of anything really to take care of all these people. And the roadways, of course, weren't going to be used or used to having that much traffic on them, both foot traffic and different carts and different apparatuses that people are using to move all their stuff from the farm to the city. There's going to be a lot more traffic, and there's going to be a lot more people. And the cities weren't prepared for that internally whenever all these people came. And as a result, disease, crime, and poverty were common. So you could end up moving from the lower class up to the middle class, but you could drop down from the middle class to the lower class, or you could just stay in the lower class if that's where you were. If you come in, you don't have a lot of money, you don't have somewhere to stay, you can't stay in an inn, you don't have the money for it, you can't buy your own home. There's a lot that you don't have access to in the city without money. And so poverty was common. Crime was common. If you didn't have money and you couldn't get a factory job, or you weren't making enough of the factory job and your family still needed to eat, then you may steal from someone to be able to make ends meet. And so crime was common. And then disease. With so many people living so closely together, if one person got sick, it was going to spread very quickly, and so disease was common. So there were some negatives to this rapid urbanization. And working class individuals. Now, we talked about how they had the possibility to move up, but we also talked about how they may stick with jobs that were demeaning and not very lucrative. So some working class individuals were probably not pleased with their new lives. They had 18-hour days sometimes, many times. They had low wages. The factory owners knew all these people wanted to work in factories, so they didn't have to pay them that much. They just had to pay them enough that they could get workers in the door. And if people were waiting in line to work there, you didn't have to pay them that much more. You could just pay them the bare minimum that they would come to work for. And dangerous machinery. These factories had people working in there, but they were also full of dangerous machines, and so that was something that you had to worry about on a daily basis if you are working in a factory. And they also, you have to think about who was working. Women and children also worked. So the men were going into these dangerous machinery-filled factories and working these 18-hour days for low wages, but women and children were doing the same thing, and they were often paid less than men. And they were also usually given the most menial jobs. So if they thought the men could lift stuff and they could figure stuff out better, then they would be given better jobs. The women and children may have been given jobs that were more along the lines of cleaning up after people, sweeping, washing dishes, sewing. They weren't going to be given the better jobs. They were going to be given worse jobs, harder jobs sometimes, and they were going to be paid less than men. So they were working in these same dangerous conditions a lot of the time, but being paid less. So while there were some benefits to people moving very quickly to the city, there were also some drawbacks as well. A small rebellion led by a group called the Luddites tried to resist industrialization and were known for vandalizing factory equipment. So they were one group who did not like this industrialization. They didn't like all the bad things they saw come with it, and they didn't like the social class changing, and they said, okay, we don't want all this industrialization. We want things to kind of stay how they were, but that didn't really work out. For the most part, people were optimistic about the prospect of upward mobility. They thought they might be able to move from a lower social class to a higher one. And they were willing to endure hardship for hope. So even though they were working these bad jobs for low pay, they had that hope, that option that they could advance, that they could make more money, that they could have better lives here in the city. So the Industrial Revolution was just whenever, all at once in the 19th century, very quickly energy sources came along that were new to people and increased productivity. And one of the big things was that the factory system came about, where each person would work on one step in the process and it would get things done quicker. That division of labor increased productivity. And with all of this, with the factory system, there was a rapid increase of population to cities throughout Europe. The Holocaust. The Holocaust is the name given to the systematic killing of Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, and others by the Nazis before and during World War II. So this is something that happened in Germany and German-occupied territory, and the German Nazis were the ones who carried it out. It was their leader, Hitler's, goal to eradicate all Jews from Germany and from Europe. And so it was a systematic killing of Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, and others. So there were other targets, but it was primarily Jews that were targeted. And anti-Semitism which is the hatred of Jews, had existed in Europe for millennia. So it had existed for thousands of years in Europe. Hating the Jews was not a new thing for Europeans, but the Nazis gave it renewed emphasis because they felt that their race was superior and this inferior race needed to be destroyed. And after making numerous false claims about the Jews, if they said bad things about the Jews, it would be easier to get people on board with getting rid of them. So after they made many false claims about the Jews, they began persecuting them upon Hitler's rise to power in 1933. So you see that even if they didn't start killing them right away, this system, the systematic killing, the system of persecution and eventually killing them began around the time that Hitler rose to power. And they were being targeted because they were Jewish, and that was it. It wasn't because they were actually doing anything wrong or provoking any kind of attacks, but the Nazis started to round up the Jews and started to take away some of their rights and privileges and property, and then they eventually started to carry out the rest of this system and begin killing them. So at the beginning, Jews were disenfranchised, which meant they lost the right to vote. They were forced into ghettos where they lived. And these would be areas that were small in size and didn't have a ton of houses compared to the number of people that were forced to live there. And all the Jews were forced to live there together so they could be kind of closed off from the outside populace. They weren't supposed to live in the same area. They were all supposed to be, the Jews were all supposed to be living in one area where the other German people lived in other areas outside of those ghettos. They had their property taken away, so if they were living in one home, they may have been forced to leave that home, give up all their possessions in that home, and move into one of these ghettos. And they were finally sent to work and then be killed in concentration camps. And these were basically like prisons where the people were kept and forced to work until they either died or until they were killed in mass murders, basically. They went about it different ways. Some were poisoned in gas chambers, others were killed in different ways. But in all, approximately 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. That is a huge number of people to be killed, and this was primarily in Europe, and this was just over the course of maybe 10 to 15 years when Hitler came to power and then through World War II. Now at the end of World War II, the Holocaust ended because Germany was defeated. But over that period of time, 6 million Jews were killed simply because they were Jewish. There wasn't a good reason for this, only that the German people felt that they were superior, and this was Hitler's goal, to eradicate the Jewish race. As the situation for the Germans became more dire during World War II, whenever the Germans saw that they were losing ground, when they had all this territory, but they were losing it, and the opposing forces were making them retreat further and further, and they saw that it was likely that they were going to lose the war, Hitler sought to implement what he called the final solution. In which hundreds of thousands were killed just before Germany fell. So that would be just before Nazi Germany fell to the Allied troops. So the final solution was what Hitler called the final solution to the Jewish problem. And his solution was just to kill them all and get rid of the race. And so since he'd already killed a lot, but they hadn't just been killed, they had been sent to concentration camps where they were made to work, and some had died, but they weren't just killed all at once. But in the last little bit of World War II, when the Germans saw the end coming, they tried to hurry up and kill as many Jews as they could before they lost the war and finish carrying out the final solution. Obviously, they didn't kill all the Jews, but they did kill hundreds of thousands more just before the end of the war, and around 6 million Jews total throughout the Holocaust. So this was still a huge impact and a huge dent in the Jewish population. And this was Hitler's goal, which he promoted and sold to the German people. The German people believed what Hitler was saying about their race being superior and about the need to get rid of the Jewish problem. And so these people were simply killed for being Jewish. Now there were, of course, consequences following the Holocaust. And these consequences were for the Germans, the Jews, and for the rest of the world, because this was such a dramatic event. Many of the Nazi leaders were tried and convicted at the Nuremberg trials for their roles in the Holocaust. So Hitler committed suicide right before the Germans fell. He saw the end was near, he committed suicide. Some of the other higher up German leaders either committed suicide themselves or they were killed before they were captured. But there were still plenty of Nazi leaders that had participated in promoting the Holocaust, promoting the killing of Jews. And so those leaders were tried and convicted at what were known as the Nuremberg trials for their roles in the Holocaust. West Germany would later issue a federal compensation law which gave billions of dollars to survivors. So surviving Jews who had made it out of Germany or out of Europe, who had hid away long enough for the war to end and for the Nazi leaders to be dealt with so that they could come out and be free. These survivors were paid altogether billions of dollars through the federal compensation law in West Germany. During and after the Holocaust, Zionist Jews fled to Palestine. They said, okay, we'll get out of Europe, we'll go to the Holy Land that we can all flock to together and make a Jewish majority there. Public sympathy with their plight would be a main reason for the creation of Israel in 1948. So the state of Israel was created for the Jewish people after World War II, after the Holocaust, because people felt so bad about what had been done to the Jews that they said, okay, we will set up the state of Israel for the Jewish people. And that is the only place in the world where there is a Jewish majority. So there still are Jews that travel there either to visit because it is their holy land or try to go and live there. So there are still Zionist Jews who are trying to promote more people to move into Israel to give them an even bigger majority. But after the Holocaust and during the Holocaust, there was a mass flood of Jews into Palestine as they were trying to leave and escape what was happening in Europe. And so the ones who made it there, the survivors, eventually got to live in what was created for them as the state of Israel. The total destruction of the Jewish community in Europe caused many Jews to question their faith. When the Jews who stayed in Europe and saw the total destruction, saw friends and family members killed or taken away, never to return, this shook their faith. This made a lot of them question their faith. How could God let this happen to them? And those that remained in Europe were and have been markedly more secular than their ancestors, which just means that they let more of an influence from the world come into their lives. They don't practice Judaism as devoutly as their ancestors had. They may give in and take on more worldly customs, not practice all of the Jewish holidays the same that their ancestors would have, and so Judaism may not be as prominent as a part of their life as it was for their ancestors, because they kind of lost some of their faith seeing what had happened during the Holocaust. The shock of the Holocaust also caused many institutions, including the Roman Catholic Church, to consider their own underlying anti-Semitism. Remember, we talked about how anti-Semitism was not something new for Europe. It was something that had been going on for thousands of years. And the Roman Catholic Church was another group that looked down on Jews and said that they weren't practicing what they should be practicing because they weren't practicing what the Roman Catholic Church preached. And so there was some anti-Semitism coming from there. But any groups, including the Roman Catholic Church, who had previously practiced anti-Semitism really took a step back and looked at what they'd been saying and what they'd been doing, and many tried to correct that because they saw what a terrible devastation had occurred with the Jewish population due to the eccentric and extreme anti-Semitism that Hitler and the Nazis practiced. And they didn't want anything like that to happen again. And so many of the people who, or groups who had practiced anti-Semitism in the past kind of withdrew from that and at least made some changes for a more positive future. And then anti-genocide legislation was created in response to the Holocaust. Well, genocide is the extermination of a whole group based on their race, nationality, ethnicity, their historical background, what that group holds closely. So it could be a race, it could be a nation, it could just be an ethnicity, but trying to exterminate a whole group based on that kind of consideration, that is what genocide is. So anti-genocide legislation was created in response to the Holocaust because, of course, the Holocaust was just genocide of the Jews. But unfortunately, it was not strict enough to rally international support against the Hutu Rwandans, who slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Tutsis in 1994. So, as recently as 1994, we had people in Rwanda. You had the Hutus and the Tutsis, and those were the two major groups within Rwanda. Well, the Hutus had the majority, and the Tutsis were in the minority. And simply because the Tutsis were Tutsis, the Hutus slaughtered hundreds of thousands of them. And even though we had these anti-genocide laws in place, they weren't strict enough for international support to come to the Tutsis' rescue. You didn't have a lot of countries coming in and saying, whoa, 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 stop this, we're going to back up the Tutsis, you can't just kill them because of their historical ties, because they are that one group. So even as recently as 1994, we had something similar occur. And then the Bosnian Serbs and Croats also killed thousands of Muslims in the early 1990s. So again, pretty recently, we had a group being persecuted simply for what they believed because of their religious inclination. So even though we had the Holocaust to kind of teach us a lesson, there are still places in the world where there's going to be genocide, where there are going to be people persecuted or killed simply because of their beliefs or their ethnicity or their nationality. There are some laws in place to protect against that, but it doesn't mean that every country is going to follow them and rush to these people's defense. So the Holocaust was something that occurred in Europe from around the time Hitler came into power in 1933 through the end of World War II. And it was the systematic rounding up and persecution and killing of the Jews throughout that period until approximately 6 million were killed. This was what Hitler referred to as a final solution. He was trying to get rid of the Jewish problem because he felt, and many of his supporters felt, that the Aryan race, the German people, were superior to other races, and that meant that the Jews were inferior and they wanted to get rid of them. There were consequences to this. Many of those Nazi leaders were tried and convicted for their crimes. There was some compensation for survivors in that West Germany paid billions of dollars out to surviving Jews after World War II. But there were also some negative consequences. Many of the Jews who survived and still live in Europe lost some of their faith and don't practice Judaism as devoutly as their ancestors did because their faith was shaken by this event. And we did, of course, have one more positive outcome in that all the Jews flocking to Palestine led to public sympathy supporting the creation of the State of Israel. So that was another good thing to come out of this. But the Holocaust was a terrible time and event during World War II and a little bit before, where the Jews were systematically rounded up and killed by the Nazi Germans. The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a statement that was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, and it was adopted by the 13 American colonies who formed the Continental Congress. Now, the Declaration of Independence said that King George III of Britain had violated the rights of American colonists. He had put into effect different laws and taxes on the American colonists that seemed unfair to them and took away some of their rights. So the Continental Congress convened to try to come up with a solution. Fighting had already been going on for over a year at the time that this Second Continental Congress occurred, and they decided there wasn't going to be a peaceful way to solve things with Britain. So they declared themselves independent. They said King George had violated the rights of these American colonists, and therefore it announced that the 13 colonies considered themselves as independent states, no longer part of the British Empire. Instead, they said that they formed a new union of those 13 states to be known as the United States of America. So they had tried to work things out peacefully. King George did not take back those laws and taxes. Instead, he fought the American colonists whenever they rebelled against following those laws and paying those taxes. And so after a year of fighting, the Continental Congress met again, and they formed this Declaration of Independence. They declared that they were independent of Britain and that they were their own nation now, to be known as the United States of America. They were no longer part of the British Empire. John Adams was a leader at the Continental Congress, and he pushed for independence. So at first, not everyone was for independence. They thought that was a little radical. They thought maybe they could still make things work with Britain. But after a year of fighting, John Adams was still pushing independence, and it was sounding better to everyone. So on July 2nd, 1776, all 13 colonies unanimously approved this idea to declare themselves independent from Britain. John Adams convinced the committee to allow Thomas Jefferson to write the draft. So Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. Congress edited the draft, and the final version was ratified, which means approved. Everyone agreed to it, and it was ratified by all 13 colonies, or states as they were to be known, on July 4th, 1776. So this date is our date of independence. The day we celebrate as Independence Day was the day that our Declaration of Independence had been edited and everyone signed it and approved it. Everyone who was there from the 13 colonies as representatives at this Continental Congress. Now, Jefferson was influenced by John Locke, who was a 17th century writer, and this was evidenced in his ideas about natural rights. John Locke had written about natural rights, and Jefferson included this in his declaration. Jefferson asserted that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So John Locke had said people have the right to life, liberty, and private property. So Jefferson subbed happiness for private property. While, of course, I'm sure he still meant that people could have private property, he put it in a little bit broader terms. Everyone is entitled to life. Everyone is entitled to liberty, to be free, and everyone is entitled to pursue happiness. And they felt like King George had infringed on some of those natural rights. And so Jefferson was using most of what John Locke had written whenever he wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as natural rights that were being violated in the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson felt and had the Declaration reflect that the purpose of government was to protect the rights of people. Individual rights were more important than the individual's obligations to the state. King George had the opposite idea, and he was trying to force his laws and his taxes on the colonists. So people who were signing the Declaration of Independence were agreeing that people's individual rights were more important than their obligation to the state or to their government. So people's individual rights should come first, and then their obligations to the state. And that is what Jefferson was trying to reflect in the Declaration of Independence. So on July 4th, 1776, all 13 colonies, all representatives from those 13 colonies, to be known as states, ratified the Declaration of Independence, which declared that King George had violated rights of American colonists, and now those 13 colonies were to be known as the United States of America, a separate new nation that was no longer tied to the British Empire.
In this video, we want to go over prefixes. Prefixes are short little sections of words that come before the root of a word and help you understand what the word means. They add an extra nuance to the word. And why prefixes and suffixes, for that matter, are important, prefixes coming before the root of the word, suffixes, short little endings after the word, is that if you know your basic prefixes and suffixes, they help you determine the meaning of a word. And they're important clues, especially if you're taking a standardized test where they say we want you to find the word with the opposite meaning. Sometimes just knowing the prefix can give you enough of a clue, even if you don't know what the root means, to find the opposite. We've got a few examples on the board and we want to go through those briefly just to show you the importance of prefixes, how they can help you in your test-taking strategies, and how they can help you understand the meanings of words. So prefixes give clues as to a word's meaning. Knowing them can help you find the word with the opposite meaning on a test. So words like prefixes like pre. Here we think pre-operative, pre-op. That means before the operation. Or prescient. Pre meaning before, and scient from the word science, which means knowledge. So to know ahead of time. So prescient is to know ahead of time. Pre-game show, the part that comes before the game. So pre means before. The opposite of pre is post. Post-operative care, the care that happens after the operation. Post-game show, the show that happens after the game. So pre is before, post is after. If you realize this opposites, then if you see a word that's got a pre-prefix on it, then you look for a word with a post-prefix on it if the test is asking you to find the opposite. Another thing would be pro and d. So pro means for, as in pro-life. Someone who is pro-life is for life. De is the negation, so deconstruction. To deconstruct is the opposite of, or the negation of construction. Construction to build up, deconstruct to destroy. So pro meaning for, de is usually a negation, pre before, post after. Knowing your prefixes can be critical, especially if you're not sure of the whole word. You can say, well, let me break this word up into its prefix, its root, and its suffix, and see if I can't decode just from that minimal information the proper answer on the other side. Now, obviously, when you're taking a test, if you know the right answer, you always go with the right answer. But if you're struggling, if you're not sure, this is a strategy you can use. You can look at the word, break it down, and say, here's the prefix, and I know it means this, and I'm being asked to find the opposite. What's the opposite of this prefix? Then I've got my answer more than likely. Caution though, caution. Con and pro are opposites, but congress is not the opposite of progress, although some people might disagree. That's more of a joke in terms of Congress being the opposite of progress, but con and pro are opposites, but you have to know and be careful sometimes. Anyway, that's been just a basic introduction and overview of the importance of prefixes as a test-taking strategy of knowing what they mean to help you determine the meaning of a word, and also to assist you if you're being asked to look for the opposite. If you know what the prefix means and you know what the opposite of that prefix is, it makes it a snap to find the right answer. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. While you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Theme. Theme is the overall idea of a piece of literature. So think about the lesson or moral of the story that the author is trying to get across to you. One thing to remember is do not confuse theme with plot. Plot is what the characters do. It's the action of the story. It does not have to do with the overall lesson or message that the author is getting across. Now, obviously, what the characters do is going to help you understand the theme, but plot and theme are not the same thing. Plot is going to be more about human nature, society, and life in general. There can also be more than one theme. The author may have one overall message, but there may be a few messages in there, or you may be able to find more than one theme besides the main controlling theme of the story. Some questions to ask yourself are, what is the lesson or message? And some common themes are, man struggles against society, man struggles against nature, overcoming adversity, the importance of family and friendship, man struggles with faith, sacrifices bring rewards, and honesty is the best policy. So for all of these, I want us to look at the story of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. And this shows you that there can definitely be more than one theme for one story. Now, all of these may not be what Aesop had in mind when he was coming up with this fable, but I was able to see all of these themes in the story. The last one, I couldn't come up with something for, but I've got a good one for that as well. So, man struggles against society. You've got this tortoise who feels like he's going to keep going and he's going to try to win the race, but all of society is against him and saying, oh, that hare has got you beat. He's way faster than you. I don't know why you think you're fast enough to beat him. So I'm sure that tortoise was struggling against society's views of him. Another one would be man struggle against nature. The tortoise is struggling against the nature of his self, how he's made. He's obviously not going to be as fast as the hare. He's going to have to go up hills. He's going to be fighting against the very nature of his self, where the hare is made to go much faster. Overcoming adversity. Just simply winning the race, the tortoise ended up winning even though no one expected him to do it. Even though people were probably telling him, oh, you can't do that. The hare's always going to beat you. The importance of family and friendship. Now, I've talked a lot about society, telling the tortoise he couldn't do this, but I'd like to think that the tortoise had some family and friends on his side that were urging him on, that helped him feel like he could actually go through and win this race. Man struggles with faith. The tortoise had to have faith in himself. The hare was very, very cocky. He felt like he had this race won, so much so that he went and took a nap, where the tortoise didn't do that. He had faith in himself and knew that he could do this if he just kept going, if he gave it his all. And then sacrifices bring rewards. The tortoise sacrificed that nap that the hare took, and in the end he won the race because he just kept going. Now, the moral of the story they give you is slow and steady wins the race, but I can see all of these themes in that story. Now, honesty is the best policy. I couldn't really come up with one for, but you can always look at Pinocchio. Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew. It was not a good thing. Every time he lied, something bad happened to him. I won't ruin the whole story for you, but everyone knows about the growing nose, which is a sad punishment for someone who is not using honesty. So it's showing you honesty is the best policy. So whenever you're reading a story, you can look at what the characters are doing to figure out what the plot is, but remember the theme is different. The theme is going to be the controlling idea in that piece of literature. And you want to ask yourself, what is the lesson or moral the author is trying to get across to me? Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now, when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, but by seeing green-feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you can look at are synonyms. If you hear the soft and supple leather, well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green-feathered bird, well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay, we were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means. And you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky, unfamiliar word. Figurative language. Figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of a word, and authors will use figurative language to enhance their writing. Some common examples of figurative language are hyperbole, simile, metaphor, and personification. So we'll discuss each of those and I'll give you some examples for each. Hyperbole is exaggeration. People will say something and you aren't meant to take it literally. You're meant to know it's an exaggeration, but it's there just to emphasize how strongly the author is trying to convey something. For instance, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I bet some of you have probably heard that one. And 1,000,000 times, really? Probably you haven't heard whatever your parent or teacher has said they've told you 1,000,000 times. It's an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize that they've already told you this a lot more times before now. Another example would be, I had a ton of homework. You did not literally go home with 2,000 pounds of homework, but you're telling people I had a lot of homework. It was way more than the normal amount. It was a ton. It was that much homework. So that's what hyperbole is, exaggeration. Next we've got simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. And this is very important. You have to use those words like or as, or it's not going to be a simile anymore. So, the child howled like a coyote. We see our word like. You're comparing two things in this sentence. The child howled like a coyote compares the child to a coyote using the word like. This example is letting you know that the child is loud. Its crying sounds like a howl, much like a coyote. So this figurative language is used to bring a coyote to mind to help you picture and hear in your mind how this child is screaming or crying. Next, let's look at this example. She ran as fast as lightning. Well, that's going to compare two things here, and we see the word as. So what is being compared in this sentence? She ran as fast as lightning. And usually when you have one as, you've got two. So it's comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. And that is being done by using the word as. So when you're comparing a girl to lightning, you're saying she's that fast. It went so fast you barely got to see her before she got past you or got to the finish line. So it's just letting you know she's really, really fast. So that's what simile is, comparing two things using like or as. And again, these are the important words to look for to make it actually be a simile. It could be a metaphor, which compares two things without using like or as. And that is really the big difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor does not use like or as. So let's look at some metaphor examples. She was lightning running down the track. So this sentence is very similar to this one. They're both comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. They're both saying this girl is really fast, but this one just says she was lightning. She was lightning running down the track. It doesn't say she ran as fast as lightning. It doesn't use like or as, it just says she was lightning. So it's a different way to use the same kind of figurative language. So that's one example of a metaphor. Let's look at this. And this is an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. Now this one's a little trickier because it doesn't just come out and say, this was this, or this is this. Like here it said she was lightning. But it says that his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. So we're comparing his eyes to a demon's eyes, which is basically comparing him, or a man, to a demon. If his eyes are like a demon's eyes, then this man is being compared to a demon, which is to maybe say that the man is evil. It doesn't mean he's literally a demon. It means he's got some characteristic of a demon. He's maybe an evil person. So in poetry, your figurative language may not always pop out at you if it's a metaphor. A simile is pretty easy to spot because you'll see like or as. But a metaphor might be a little trickier. So just look for what two things are being compared in that sentence or that phrase of a poem. And the last piece of figurative language we're going to discuss is personification, which is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. You are personifying it. You are making it do something a person would do, even though it's not something that can do these things. And remember, inanimate objects are going to be things that are not alive. A chair, a teapot, the wind, water, those are inanimate objects. So the example here, the water slapped the side of the boat. The water slapped. Can water actually slap like a person would slap? No, but it makes you think of the action of slapping and the sound you might hear with the slap whenever you picture this water slapping the side of the boat. And that's why they're using this particular word and personifying the water. Depending on what the story is about where this sentence appears, it could be that the water is being made as like an evil character. If someone drowns in this story, then the water would be seen as an enemy, and so it slapping the side of the boat would give it that negative feeling. Another example, the teapot shrieked. Shrieking, screaming, that loud sound, you can hear it in your head when you think about the noise a teapot makes. But a teapot isn't actually shrieking like a person would. It's simply making that noise because the air is hot enough that it's trying to get out now. Or the wind howled. Wind can't howl like a wolf would howl, but wind makes that same kind of sound sometimes, and so the author is trying to put that sound of howling in your mind when they're describing the wind. So figurative language can be a lot of different things. Hyperbole, where you're exaggerating. Simile, where you're comparing two things using like or as. Very important markers for a simile. Metaphor, where you're comparing two things without using like or as. And personification, when an object is given human qualities, whenever it's personified. And all of these techniques are used so that the words will go beyond the literal meaning of them and give you a deeper understanding of the poem or the work that you're reading. The author is trying to go beyond the words and make you really think about their meaning and put certain connotations in your head whenever you're reading.
Ratios. A ratio is a comparison between two quantities. You can think of a ratio like a fraction, and since it's just like a fraction, a comparison of two numbers, it is treated a lot like a fraction, meaning you're going to simplify it anytime you can. Let's look at this problem. Suppose a sampling of fish from a local pond contains 12 bass, 8 catfish, 38 minnows, and 4 trout. What is the ratio, so the comparison of two numbers, of bass to minnows? Now, when they ask you this question, they're telling you exactly how to set your ratio up. Since it says bass to minnows, we read left to right. We also read from top to bottom. Since a ratio is a fraction, then they're telling you what your numerator should be and what your denominator should be. So our ratio is going to be bass to minnows. And now we can substitute how many bass and minnows we have. According to our problem, we have 12 bass and we have 38 minnows. So that ratio would be 12 to 38. But again, since this is a fraction, we're going to simplify it if we can. And 12 and 38 do have a GCF of 2, so we're going to divide 12 by 2 to get 6, and we'll divide 38 by 2 to get 19. Therefore, our ratio of bass to minnows is 6 to 19. But that's not the only way we can write a ratio. We could also write it as 6 to 19 or as 6 to 19. And these all mean the same thing, and they all give you the same information, that for every 6 bass in the pond, there are 19 minnows in your pond. It is important, though, the order of your numbers. Since the ratio they were asking for was bass to minnows, your bass number should be first, and then your minnows number. So make sure you put it in the right order. That is very important. Fractions. A fraction is a number that is expressed as one integer written above another integer with a dividing line between them, like x divided by y. So for example, 3/4. In this fraction, 3/4, the top number is called the numerator, and the bottom number is called the denominator. The numerator is the part that's being considered, while the denominator is the whole. So in this fraction, 3/4, we could take a pie shape and cut it into 4 pieces. That's our whole. And the part that's being considered is 3/4. So 1, 2, 3. So now you can see how much of our pie we're talking about, 3/4. We can manipulate fractions, and we do this by multiplying or dividing both the numerator and the denominator by the same number, not by adding and subtracting. We manipulate fractions to do many things. One thing is to compare them. If we were to compare 3/4 and 2/3, we would first need to find what's called a common denominator. Because in order to compare them, I need them to have the same denominator, so I can tell which one's bigger or if they're equal. So we'll take 3/4 and 2/3, and we're going to find a common denominator. When you do that, you want to look for multiples of the denominators. And the least common multiple will be the least common denominator. So the multiples of 4 and 3, 4 is 4, 8, 12, 16, etc. 3 is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, etc. So the least common multiple between 4 and 3 is 12. So that means I want to change this fraction to something over 12. Same with my other fraction. What I'm doing is creating an equivalent fraction. 3/4 is equal to something over 12. So I'm going to multiply my numerator and my denominator both by 3 to achieve that denominator of 12. So 3 times 3 is 9. And so our fraction is 9/12. And then for 2/3, we'll do a similar thing. We want to change our denominator from 3 to 12. So we multiply 3 times 4 to get 12. And we must do the same to our numerator. 2 times 4 is 8. So now we can easily see which fraction is larger. 3/4 is equivalent to or equal to 9/12. And 2/3 is equal to 8/12. Well, 9 out of 12 is definitely more than 8 out of 12. So we could say that this fraction 3/4 is bigger than this fraction 2/3 if we were to compare them. So let's talk a little bit more about equivalent fractions. All of these fractions are equivalent fractions because they all represent the same value. 2/10, 3/15, 4/20, 5/25. And we could see that they represent the same value more easily by simplifying our fractions. So we said we can manipulate fractions by multiplying the numerator and denominator by the same value, or we can manipulate them by dividing the numerator and denominator by the same value. So if we wanted to simplify this fraction 2/10, we would just divide the numerator and the denominator by the same value. Both 2 and 10 are divisible by 2. So we divide our numerator by 2 and our denominator by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We do the same thing to our next fraction. 3 and 15 are both divisible by 3. So we divide our numerator by 3 and our denominator by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 15 divided by 3 is 5. 4/20. Our numerator and denominator are both divisible by 4. So divide by 4, divide by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And 20 divided by 4 is 5. Finally, 5/25. Numerator and denominator are both divisible by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. And 25 divided by 5 is 5. So as you can see, all 4 of these fractions are equal to 1/5. 1/5 is the simplest form of these fractions, and they are all equivalent fractions since they all have the same value, 1/5. Multiples. You can think of multiples as like counting by that number. So for instance, the multiples of 2 would be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. The multiples of 3 would be 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, etc. The multiples of 4 would be 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and so on. Sometimes you're asked to find the LCM of 2 or more numbers. The LCM is the least common multiple. Least meaning the smallest, common meaning the same, and multiple. So if we wanted to find the LCM of, let's say, 2 and 3, the least common multiple of 2 and 3, so the smallest number that 2 and 3 have in common, would be 6. So that's the LCM of 2 and 3. The LCM of, say, 3 and 4, the very smallest number that they have in common would be 12. And you can find the least common multiple of bigger numbers, like, say, the least common multiple of 12 and 15. So 12 would be 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, etc. While 15 would be 15, 30, 45, 60, So if we were finding the LCM of 12 and 15, the smallest number they have in common is 60. So the least common multiple is 60.
In math, we have rational numbers and we have irrational numbers. So we're going to be taking a look at rational numbers, which have 4 different categories, and those are integers, percents, fractions, and decimals. So we're going to define each of these. Even if you're already somewhat familiar with them, we're going to go ahead and define them and give some examples. So starting out with integers. Integer is a positive or negative whole number or 0. So 9 would be a whole number. It would be an integer because it's a positive whole number. -6 is an integer because it's a negative whole number. Then, of course, 0 is an integer because we said it was. And so now we move on to percent, which is kind of a more complicated way to say percent is a part per 100. So an example of a percent is 20%, which we could also write as 20 parts per 100. But the important thing here is just you know what a percent is, like 20%. Then fractions, which is a proportion. So an example would be 20 divided by 10 or 2 divided by 4. And of course we have decimals, so this is where we have an integer, maybe 1, maybe 89, maybe 0. And then we have a decimal place, and then we have numbers after the decimal, like 20.53. So we have our integer, we have a decimal, and then we have numbers after the decimal. So integers, percents, fractions, and decimals are all rational numbers, usually. There are some rules. So in order to be a rational number, just summarize, it either has to be an integer, like we talked about. If it's a number like 9, -6, 0, it's always going to be a rational number. It gets more complicated when we come to fractions and decimals. If it's a fraction, it has to be an integer divided by an integer. And this integer cannot equal 0. So it's an integer divided by an integer. So 7 divided by 4 cuts it. That works. Now, decimals are a little bit more complicated because it either has to be a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal. So an example of a terminating decimal would be something like 2 divided by 4. From that you get 0.5. It ends right there at the 5. Or a repeating decimal, you do 1 divided by 3 and you get 0.3333. It goes on forever. But notice we're getting the same number every time. So really you could erase all of these 3's and just put a line over the 3 showing it's a repeating decimal. What you don't want is a decimal like pi, where you have 3.1415926. 5359. It just keeps going on and on. So there's no ending to it, so it's not a terminating decimal, and there's no pattern to it, so it's not a repeating decimal. That's what an irrational number is, one that just keeps going like this. These numbers, they have basically a stopping point. And so that's what we're looking for. And so the reason I say that a fraction has to be an integer over an integer is because when you divide an integer by an integer, you get a clean number. You get a decimal that's repeating or terminating. When you start dividing a decimal or a fraction by a number or a fraction by another fraction, that's when you're going to start getting messy. So really, if you're wondering whether a fraction is a rational number, what you can do is go ahead and divide it out and then look at the decimal and decide whether it's terminating, repeating, or non-ending. And that's how you can determine if it was a rational number.
Decimals. Decimals use place value to represent an amount. To read a decimal, like we have here, first read the number to the left as a whole number, followed by and, then read the number to the right of the decimal, followed by the last place value. So this number would be read as 641 and 5,129 10,000ths. This number could also be represented as a mixed number. 641 and 5,129 10,000ths. Let's look at another decimal. 5 and 8,139 10,000ths. We could write this number as an improper fraction by taking the 5 plus, this would be 8 tenths, since it's in the tenths place, plus 1/100ths, plus 3/1000ths, plus 9/10,000ths, which would give us 58,139 10,000ths. So we've seen a decimal in decimal form. We've seen it represented as a mixed number and also as an improper fraction.